The sun blazed down relentlessly on the vast, desolate stretches of the Sahara. Only sand as far as the eye could see, an ocean of scorching golden waves. The air was thick with heat, shimmering in a way that twisted and bent the distant horizon. Silence surrounded them, an unnerving quiet that felt like a weight pressing down on their backs. The team trudged along, each step sinking slightly in the shifting sand. They had been here for days, exploring a region rumored to hold ancient secrets. Led by Dr. Claire Lawson, a seasoned archaeologist with years of experience in uncovering the forgotten mysteries of the world, they had come seeking traces of an ancient civilization, one that predated everything known to history. Claire was no stranger to the challenges of the desert, but even she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Her team of 3, Aaron, a wiry geologist with a talent for sniffing out unusual rock formations, Samir, a local guide with an encyclopedic knowledge of the Sahara, and Olivia, a young anthropology intern eager to prove herself, felt it too. None of them said it out loud, but there was a tension in the air, like they were being watched by eyes unseen, judged by forces they couldn't understand. Hours passed in silence, their voices all but swallowed by the immensity of the desert. The sun dipped low, casting long shadows that danced across the sand. And then, as if by some twisted trick of fate, the wind picked up. It came suddenly, swirling the sand in powerful gusts, creating clouds of dust that obscured their vision. The storm raged for only a few minutes, but when it cleared, they saw something new. Half buried in the sand, just ahead, was a strange structure. Stone walls rose from the ground, edges smoothed by centuries, possibly millennia, of wind erosion. Intrigued, they approached, carefully brushing away the sand that clung to the ancient stones. The structure was unlike anything they'd seen, its surfaces adorned with markings that seemed neither Egyptian nor anything from known African civilizations. Claire's pulse quickened. She examined the markings closely, trying to identify any recognizable symbols or patterns. The stone was warm to the touch, even warmer than the desert itself, as if it held a life of its own. "These inscriptions, they don't belong here," Claire muttered, her voice barely above a whisper. Samir nodded, eyes wide. "I've traveled these sands my whole life, and I've never seen anything like this." As they ventured further, they noticed that one section of the stone wall seemed different. It shimmered under the fading sunlight, as if it was alive, breathing with the air around it. The wall appeared to shift subtly, like looking through a mirage. Only it was no mirage. As Claire moved closer, her heart pounded, a strange hum vibrating the air around them. Aaron, the most skeptical of the group, narrowed his eyes. "What is that?" Claire extended her hand, her fingers inches from the shimmering surface. There was a sense of wrongness about it, an unnaturalness that prickled her skin. And yet, she was compelled. She could almost see something beyond a faint, distorted image of a place that wasn't part of this world. It was a window, a gateway. The shimmering intensified, flashing slightly, and Olivia gasped, taking a step back. "Are we looking at another dimension?" Samir crossed his arms, shaking his head. "This place is cursed. We should leave it alone." But Claire's curiosity was insatiable. "We can't ignore this. If this truly is a portal to another place, maybe even another world, we owe it to science to investigate." She looked at her team, gauging their reactions. Aaron looked intrigued, Olivia was nervous, and Samir was visibly uncomfortable. Yet, none of them moved to leave. A low hum emanated from the gateway, a sound that felt as though it was seeping into their very bones. It wasn't like anything they'd heard before, deep and resonant, vibrating in their chests. Olivia clutched at her shirt, eyes darting between Claire and the portal. "Do you hear that? It's like it's calling us." Aaron shrugged. "It's probably just a resonance effect. The heat, the sand, the stone. It could all be causing a frequency we're not used to." Claire nodded but couldn't fully believe it. There was something sentient in the sound, as if something on the other side was aware of them, watching them. She felt it almost like a presence in her mind, a pull that made her want to move closer, to reach out and touch it. She knew it was irrational, that nothing about this should make sense, yet the compulsion grew with every passing second. Samir's voice cut through the tension. "We shouldn't do this. This isn't science. This is inviting trouble." But his warning was drowned by the feeling of discovery coursing through Claire's veins. She couldn't resist. We're scientists. Our job is to explore the unknown, to push the boundaries. This gateway is unlike anything the world has ever seen. The team hesitated, caught between fear and the allure of uncovering a mystery beyond their understanding. The hum grew louder, a throbbing beat that seemed to synchronize with their heartbeats, pulling them in. It was as if the desert itself was compelling them to make a decision, to choose between retreating to the familiar or stepping into the unimaginable. Finally, Aaron, voice shaking slightly, spoke up. "So, are we going through?" Claire took a deep breath, the weight of the decision settling heavily on her. She looked at the portal, the shimmering doorway that promised answers, or perhaps only horrors. Her gaze swept over her team, each one tense but unable to look away. The fear was palpable, thick in the air, yet so was the intrigue, the temptation to discover what lay beyond. With a final look at the swirling portal, Claire made her decision. She couldn't turn back now. She knew it, and somehow they all knew it too. "We're going in," she whispered, barely able to keep the tremor from her voice. In unison, they took a cautious step closer, eyes fixed on the shifting surface of the gateway, hearts pounding. Each one felt the same chill crawl down their spine, the same inexplicable dread coiling in the pit of their stomachs. This was more than just a gateway. It was an invitation, or perhaps a trap. As they stood on the brink of the unknown, no one spoke. The silence said it all, a shared understanding that whatever lay beyond that gateway was far from the world they knew, far from any comfort or logic. There would be no turning back now. With one last look at each other, they reached out toward the shimmering surface, hands trembling as they prepared to cross the threshold. And just like that, they stepped into the gateway, plunging headfirst into a realm where none of the rules they knew would apply. The instant they crossed the shimmering boundary, the air thickened around them like liquid, and gravity itself felt distorted. Claire's vision swam, her stomach churning as if gravity had been spun sideways. Nausea clawed up her throat, and she struggled to steady herself, her ears filled with a bizarre, humming echo that made her head throb. She could see her team's pale faces, their bodies seeming to stretch and blur, as though they were caught in a nightmare halfway between existence and oblivion. As the dizziness faded, they looked around, realizing they were in a place utterly alien. The light was low, casting everything in hues of dark green and purple, with no discernible source. The sky, if it could be called that, was a dark, pulsating void that felt more alive than atmospheric. Massive, twisted formations towered around them, structures that seemed like both rock and flesh, breathing slowly as if with a life of their own. Shadows twisted between the shapes, blurring and shifting just beyond the edge of their vision. The ground underfoot was strange, more like organic matter than soil, with strange, root-like veins weaving in patterns beneath a translucent, gelatinous surface. Each step produced a faint squelching sound, and a sticky residue clung to their boots. The smell was equally strange, a mix of damp earth and something sickly sweet, an odor that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. Olivia whimpered, glancing nervously at the writhing flora around them. Claire noticed that the plants here were strange and twisted bulbous, fleshy growths with tendrils that seemed to stretch and curl as if reaching toward them. The flora was unsettling, with hues and textures unnatural to the human eye, as if nature itself had warped and mutated into something unfamiliar, watching them with an almost predatory stillness. Aaron lifted his hand, but Claire shot him a warning glance and he lowered it, too unsettled to protest. They moved cautiously, the silence of the place broken only by the occasional drip of some thick, unknown fluid from the overhead structures and the faint clicking sounds that seemed to echo around them. Claire checked her equipment, but her compass needle spun aimlessly, and her watch showed nonsensical numbers that didn't match any clock she'd ever seen. Erin muttered, "Nothing's working. It's like this place exists outside everything." As they walked, every shadow felt like it was watching. Every shift in the light felt like movement. Just as Claire thought her nerves couldn't take much more, she heard a rustle behind her. She turned, scanning the dim landscape, her heart pounding, but there was nothing. Yet the sense of being observed persisted, lingering on her skin like a weight pressing down. Olivia's voice broke the silence, whispering, I think it's the air. It's alive, like it knows we're here." The horror sank in slowly, with realization dawning on each of them as they saw the environment not as a place, but as a presence. And then they noticed, high above, in the dark expanse that seemed both sky and something else entirely, faint shapes swirled. Not clouds, but more like drifting, amorphous entities with too many eyes and limbs, watching silently. A wave of dread washed over them, the instinctual terror of being prey. They moved faster, trying to ignore the gaze of the silent watchers above, the growing sensation that they were walking into something's trap. As they walked, Erin spotted something in the shadows. It was a small piece of metal, corroded but unmistakably man-made. Claire knelt, brushing off the strange filmy residue to reveal an old, battered compass. Its casing was rusted, the glass cracked, but it was unmistakably human. She looked around and noticed other remnants. Fragments of gear, pieces of rope, and, farther away, a faded, crumpled backpack half buried in the ground. As they examined the objects, Samir stiffened, his gaze locked on something in the distance. There, leaning against one of the towering organic structures, was a skeleton, mostly intact, its empty eye sockets staring hollowly into the void. The bones were scorched, almost fused to the grotesque fleshy surface, as if absorbed by it. A crude carving, scratched into a nearby rock, seemed to be a warning, its words barely decipherable. "Turn back." They exchanged uneasy glances, a collective chill running through them. Others had been here before. They had tried to survive, to escape, and they had failed. A wet, tearing sound cut through the thick silence, and Olivia shrieked as a fleshy tendril from one of the plants shot toward her, wrapping around her wrist with startling strength. The skin where it touched burned instantly, blistering in red patches as she fought to pull away. Erin lunged forward, hacking at it with his knife until it finally released her, retracting and writhing back into the ground, leaving behind a sickly residue. Olivia's hand shook as she stared at the angry red burns on her arm, her eyes wide with terror. Claire realized they couldn't stay in one place for long. This was a realm that actively resisted their presence, a hostile land that seemed to push them back, punishing every moment they lingered. They moved forward, deeper into the twisted landscape, every step heavy with dread, each shadow a potential threat. The strange, pulsing light cast by the sky deepened, flickering in unsettling patterns, casting shifting shadows that played tricks on their minds. As they pressed on, Claire became aware of a faint sound in the distance, a rhythmic scraping, like claws on stone. It was growing louder, a deliberate, unhurried sound that felt almost sentient, aware of its effect on them. They froze, straining to hear as the sound grew nearer, each scratch punctuated by an ominous silence. "Something's following us," Samir whispered, his voice barely audible. No one argued. The footsteps, or whatever they were, had a weight to them, a terrifying slowness that suggested it had no need to rush, no worry that they might escape. Claire motioned for the others to stay quiet, but her heart pounded so loudly she was sure it would give them away. The landscape seemed to shift as they moved, the ground squirming subtly beneath them, as if trying to draw them in, to pull them down. Just as they thought they might outrun the noise, Olivia tripped over something half buried in the muck. She pulled herself up, her hand brushing against yet another pile of decaying equipment. This one was older, with rusted metal and fabric so frayed it crumbled at her touch. An old notebook lay within it, pages yellowed and damp, barely legible. Claire flipped through, eyes darting across the entries. The words were scrawled hastily, almost panicked, notes describing attempts to escape, warnings about creatures lurking in the shadows, hints that the very air was alive, that time worked differently here. The final pages trailed off into incoherent scribbles, desperate pleas, and drawings of monstrous shapes with empty eyes. As she closed the notebook, the scratching noise returned, closer now, accompanied by a low, guttural growl. There was no question anymore. Something was tracking them, studying them, perhaps waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The air around them grew thick, oppressive, and seemed to pulse as if it had a life of its own. Every sound felt sharper, and every silence felt endless. The low hum that had greeted them when they first crossed into this world had morphed, becoming a chorus of whispers, faint voices just beyond the edge of understanding. Claire glanced around, sensing movement in her peripheral vision, shadows that flickered and vanished when she tried to focus on them. Aaron was the first to notice it. He froze, turning slowly as though listening to something none of the others could hear. "Did you hear that?" he whispered, his voice tense. "Someone's calling my name?" The others shook their heads, but as they exchanged glances, they saw doubt in each other's eyes. Claire was sure she'd heard something, too, but it was faint, almost like a whispering breeze, carrying words she couldn't quite make out. The atmosphere pressed down on them, amplifying their unease. Every step seemed to invite more voices, more ghostly murmurs that grew louder when they hesitated. Shadows deepened and stretched, shapes that looked almost human lurking in the corners of their vision, moving only when they weren't looking directly at them. Claire's stomach twisted. The shadows seemed like reflections of their own fears, growing stronger the longer they stayed here. The tension began to wear on the group, and soon they were snapping at each other, their patience frayed by paranoia. Olivia's face was pale, her voice unsteady. "I swear, I just saw myself," she murmured. "I looked back, and there was something there that looked like me, just watching." Aaron scoffed, but his voice shook. "You're imagining things. This place is getting into our heads." Samir's usually calm demeanor had frayed, and he was pacing, muttering about finding a way back to the portal. But when he took off in the direction he thought they'd come from, he found only more of the same endless, surreal landscape. He circled back, sweat beading on his forehead, mumbling under his breath, "It should be here, it should be here." His panic spread through the group like a sickness. The portal, their only hope of return, seemed to have vanished. As they continued wandering, Claire began experiencing flashes of confusion, brief blackouts where time seemed to skip. One moment she'd be walking with the group, and in the next, she'd find herself 10 paces ahead, or back where she'd started, with no memory of having moved. The others reported the same. Time was becoming a blur, reality a fluid thing that slipped through their fingers. At some point, Olivia screamed. They turned to see her staring at a pile on the ground, a crumpled mess of a jacket, a notebook, and a watch, all belonging to Aaron. But Aaron was nowhere in sight. They called his name, voices raw with desperation, but only the shadows answered, their distorted echoes of his voice mocking them. Aaron had simply vanished. Claire's pulse quickened. The land itself felt like it was warping in response to their fear, shifting subtly underfoot, twisting in ways that defied reason. She felt a prickling at the back of her mind, an awareness that something beyond her comprehension was watching them. The shadows seemed more defined now, almost like figures with vague human forms, drifting closer and then slipping away when they tried to look directly at them. She couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was here was not only aware of them, but somehow feeding on their fear and confusion. Then came the symbols. Claire noticed them first, strange, swirling patterns etched into the ground, symbols that seemed to pulse and change shape the moment she looked away. When she pointed them out to Samir, he recoiled, saying he saw only blank ground, but Olivia claimed to see the patterns, too, her voice breaking as she described them in eerie detail. The symbols shifted constantly, taking forms that seemed almost familiar, like fragments of a language they should know but couldn't grasp. The voices intensified, echoing in their minds, half-formed words mingling with memories they could barely place. At one point, Claire thought she heard her father's voice, soft and reassuring, and she found herself stepping toward the sound, desperate for some connection to reality. But as she moved, the voice twisted, turning into a mocking, distorted version of itself. She stopped, shaken, the warmth in the words replaced by a chilling emptiness. Samir began muttering to himself, his eyes wide and unfocused. He stumbled over his own feet, speaking to shadows that didn't respond. They're watching us. They know what we fear, he whispered, almost to himself. They're inside our heads. They want us to break. Claire felt the truth in his words. The entity or entities here weren't simply observing. They were manipulating, tugging at their minds, peeling back their layers of sanity, and feeding on every fractured thought. The landscape itself seemed to breathe, responding to their fears with mocking images and familiar voices that twisted into something monstrous and wrong. With Aaron gone and Samir losing his grip on reality, Claire tried to keep Olivia focused. But even Olivia was slipping, her hands shaking, her eyes darting around as if she expected the shadows to lunge at her at any moment. "I don't think they'll let us go," she whispered, eyes wide and terrified. "This place, it's alive, Claire. It doesn't want us to leave." They walked in silence, their footsteps hollow against the living ground. The thought weighed heavily on Claire. She understood now. They were trapped, lost in a labyrinth where space and time held no meaning, a place that thrived on their isolation and despair. Her mind raced, searching for some escape, some logic that would break the nightmare, but there was none. Every path they took circled back on itself. Every attempt to regain control dissolved in an instant. Finally, she stopped, her mind numb. She could see it clearly, the malevolent intelligence that loomed over this world, watching them from the shadows, feeding on their every moment of panic. It wasn't going to let them go. They were caught in a web of despair and manipulation, mere playthings in the hands of something ancient and incomprehensible. As they huddled in silence, exhausted and defeated, the whispers around them grew louder, clearer. The shadows closed in, taking on grotesque, familiar shapes, faces twisted into cruel versions of people they once knew. Claire felt a chill run through her. She understood now, fully and without doubt, that this place was their prison, and it wanted to consume them, mind by mind, until there was nothing left but hollow echoes of who they had once been. Claire's steps faltered as she felt drawn toward a dim glow emanating from somewhere in the distance. Her last hope had been to find the portal, but it was clear by now that the paths they had taken had shifted, looping endlessly, denying them any escape. She could feel the entity's presence more keenly now, its weight pressing down on her mind. Every instinct screamed at her to turn back, but something deeper compelled her forward. Through twisted arches of bone-like structures and pulsating vines, Claire stumbled upon what could only be described as the heart of this place. In the center of an open, cavernous expanse, a massive structure throbbed and shifted, half flesh, half something metallic and unknowable. The heart pulsed, a sickly green light radiating from it, casting warped shadows across the ground. She stared, transfixed by its grotesque beauty, a conglomeration of tendrils and veins, with patterns that seemed to echo the very symbols they'd seen etched into the ground. A deep hum vibrated through the space, resonating inside her skull as if trying to communicate. She saw faint impressions in her mind, flashes of faces, images of others who had been here before, all lost, absorbed. She knew with sudden clarity that this was no ordinary world. This entire realm was alive, and the entity before her was its nucleus, the source of its malevolent intelligence. She realized then that it had been luring travelers here, feeding on their fear and desperation. Her mind raced with a sense of horrifying clarity. The portal wasn't a doorway or a discovery. It was a trap. This entity, this world, had created it to ensnare beings from other worlds, to draw them into its grasp, where they would wander in circles, driven to the edge of sanity, until they finally broke. She understood now that she and her team had been baited here, as had countless others before them. The signs they'd seen, the skeletal remains, they were all remnants of those who'd wandered into this predatory world, unprepared for the fate that awaited them. Time, Claire realized, wasn't linear here. Memories of faces she didn't recognize flickered in her mind. Memories that weren't hers but felt real. Memories of those who'd come before her. Trapped here, part of the same endless cycle. She could almost hear them now. Their whispers joining the hum of the entity's pulse. Trapped in a purgatorial existence, unable to escape. The horror of it settled in her bones. Those who came here didn't simply die. They became part of this place, fragments absorbed into its consciousness, locked in an endless loop of fear and suffering. Her body shook as she backed away, desperate to leave this place, but she felt her grip on reality loosening. Her senses flickered, and she saw not just a pulsating heart but fractured visions of her own memories, replaying in quick succession. A vivid image of her childhood home appeared in the distance, bathed in soft morning light, impossibly real. She saw her family, her parents' faces, smiling at her through the mist. For one absurd moment, she felt the urge to run toward them, to collapse into their arms and leave this nightmare behind. But the mirage flickered, and she understood the entity was using her memories, playing on her deepest desires to keep her here. Each step she took was met with illusions, glimpses of her team, their faces appearing in fleeting images. She could see Aaron, reaching out to her, his face desperate and pleading, mouthing words she couldn't hear. But when she reached out, his image dissolved, replaced by Olivia, who appeared just beyond her reach, calling her name. Claire bit down on her fear, resisting the pull of these apparitions, knowing that this was the entity's way of luring her deeper, feeding on her longing to be reunited with her team. The whispers grew louder, overlapping with her own thoughts, twisting her memories. She could feel her sense of self slipping, the lines between her thoughts and the entity's influence blurring. It was as if her mind was being assimilated, her identity subsumed into the collective consciousness of those who had come before. She stumbled forward, her movements growing frantic, as the ground beneath her twisted, shifting like a living thing. And then she saw it, a faint, shimmering outline in the distance, the portal. Her heart leapt. She ran toward it, but the landscape around her distorted, the distance stretching with every step. Shapes rose from the ground, ghostly figures of those who had once stood in her place, all trapped, all part of this place now. Their faces were twisted with fear and resignation, and she understood with chilling clarity that these were not just illusions. They were remnants of real people, echoes of consciousness left here to haunt others. She pushed forward, every step like moving through quicksand. The portal was so close, yet the entity's presence grew stronger, reaching into her mind, twisting her perception, conjuring images of home, of friends she hadn't seen in years, all beckoning her to stay, to rest. The urge to stop was overwhelming, to just let go and be at peace in the false comfort of these familiar faces. But she knew this was a trap. This was how it consumed them, how it would consume her. She felt it then, a cold, calculated intelligence, probing her mind, seeking out her deepest fears and regrets. It understood her on a level no human could, because it was inside her thoughts, dissecting her memories, twisting them against her. With a final surge of clarity, Claire resisted, refusing to give in. She tore her gaze from the comforting visions, forcing herself to focus on the shimmer of the portal. Just as she reached the boundary, the entity unleashed one last assault, sending a wave of memories crashing over her. Memories not just of her own life, but fragments of lives she'd never known, lives of those who had perished here, trapped in this endless cycle. She saw them all, their final moments of horror, their desperate attempts to escape, and their ultimate acceptance of their fate. The weight of their collective despair nearly crushed her, threatening to pull her into the abyss. With one last, desperate lunge, Claire forced herself through the portal, breaking free from the entity's grasp. As she staggered back into the blinding sunlight of the desert, she could feel the last vestiges of its presence in her mind, a faint whisper that would never entirely leave her. She knew she had escaped, but she would never be free. The entity had imprinted itself on her, leaving her forever haunted by the memories of those it had consumed. As she stood alone in the vast, empty desert, the reality sank in. The gateway hadn't just led to another world. It was a trap, a predatory realm designed to lure in the curious, the brave, the foolhardy, to feed on their fears, their memories, their very souls. She had survived, but the others had not. And as she turned away from the cursed portal, she understood that she was carrying a piece of that dark realm within her, a lingering shadow that would haunt her until the end of her days. Claire stumbled through the shifting landscape, her eyes fixed on the faint shimmer she was sure marked the portal's location. Her body ached, her thoughts felt scattered, and every step was a fight to hold on to what was real. With every second, the entity's presence grew stronger, its hold on her mind more forceful, as if it sensed she was close to escaping. The hum in the air intensified, the shadows around her shifting and coalescing, forming shapes that seemed to pulse with a twisted kind of life. Then she froze. Just ahead, something immense and grotesque materialized, a writhing mass that seemed to embody the entity itself. It shifted, its form cycling through nightmarish faces and limbs, glimpses of the explorers who had come here before her, their faces contorted in agony, mouths open in silent screams. Her breath hitched as she recognized some of them. Aaron's hollow, anguished face flickered into view, then Olivia's, reaching out, pleading. The entity's form rippled, and voices filled her head, dozens of them, all fragments of lives shattered here. She clutched her ears, desperate to shut it out, but the voices only grew louder, pressing their suffering into her mind. It was showing her its victims, their fates. Twisted, melded into its own consciousness, each one a small part of this dark, hungry world. She stumbled back, horrified, as it seemed to reach out to her, an invisible force wrapping around her thoughts, tightening its grip. "No!" she gasped, her voice hoarse. She forced herself to remember her purpose, to keep moving. She had to get to the portal. She had to escape, even as the images threatened to paralyze her with terror. Every step felt like wading through a nightmare, with her mind assaulted by grotesque visions and sounds, each one designed to keep her here. She pushed through, her eyes locked on that faint glimmer in the distance, the only thing anchoring her to reality. As she got closer, the ground beneath her shifted violently, undulating in waves, as though it were trying to throw her off course. The entity's whispers turned to screams, voices of the lost clawing at her sanity, begging her to stay, to join them. Pain exploded through her head, her vision blurring as the landscape twisted, each step disorienting her, making her doubt the direction she was moving in. The shimmer wavered, seeming to drift farther away even as she neared it. She pushed forward, clinging to a sliver of hope. Her vision tunneled, her senses numbed by exhaustion and fear, but the glimmer was still there, just a few steps away. The closer she got, the more frantically the entity lashed out, throwing a torrent of memories and emotions into her mind. She stumbled, feeling her own memories warp, faces of loved ones twisting, turning into nightmarish versions of themselves. Familiar voices filled her ears, calling to her with chilling affection, pulling her backward. With a guttural scream, she broke free of the entity's mental grip and lunged toward the shimmer. Her body collided with something cold and slick, and she pushed with all her strength, feeling reality slip and twist around her. For a moment, everything was blindingly bright, as though she were suspended between two worlds, caught in a liminal space that neither accepted nor rejected her. Then, with a rush, she fell forward, landing hard on gritty sand. The blinding light faded, and as her eyes adjusted, She realized she was staring at the familiar vastness of the desert, endless dunes stretching out before her. She was back in the Sahara. But something felt wrong. The silence around her was too complete, the air too thick, as though it still carried a trace of the alien world she had just escaped. She stood, shaky and disoriented, and looked around. The ruins, the gateway, they were gone. The sand stretched on, uninterrupted. No sign of the structure that had pulled her into that nightmare. It was as if it had never existed. Relief washed over her, mingled with a disquiet that gnawed at the edges of her mind. She was free, she told herself, back in the familiar world, back in her own reality. She took a deep breath, but something felt off. The air tasted strange, and the silence seemed to press down on her, a suffocating blanket that felt all too familiar. As she began to walk, her footsteps sounded hollow against the sand, and a shiver ran down her spine. She glanced back, half expecting to see the faint outline of the portal. But there was nothing, just empty desert stretching endlessly. She shook her head, forcing herself to keep moving, to find her way back to civilization, to anyone who could ground her in reality. Yet with each step, a gnawing sense of dread grew within her. The shadows around her felt thicker, more oppressive, and she swore she could hear faint whispers echoing in the back of her mind. Whispers that sounded chillingly familiar. Her pulse quickened, her senses on high alert. She turned quickly, scanning the horizon, but there was nothing, just the empty desert stretching endlessly in every direction. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, she felt an unsettling sensation, like eyes watching her from the darkness creeping in. She tried to shake it off, but the whispers grew louder, echoes of the voices she thought she'd left behind. With a sinking realization, she understood. She hadn't truly escaped. That entity, that place, had left its mark on her, embedding itself into her mind, a part of it following her back. Her breath came faster, her heart racing. She could feel it now, a lingering presence, as if the entity had embedded itself into her thoughts, waiting, watching. She wasn't alone. She never would be again.